Overcoming our own nature. We all belong to a tribe, possibly more than one. We grow up in one. Their attitudes, beliefs, practices become our own. In the first 6 years of our life, we are in a brainwave state that is the same as being in a trance, and we absorb everything in our environment into our minds. Thanks for listening to this podcast. Tribes, power, mercenaries, my training philosophy, and what a Marine told me when I started out. Because of our incredible open state of mind when we are young, we create a belief system that becomes our operating system. If we don't stop as adults to check this system and potentially challenge some of the beliefs, we can be hitting set points in our lives and not understand why. These set points are limiting beliefs, but they are just ideas, and we can swap them out for new ones. Why is that so hard to do? We have to break the habit of being ourselves, which is reinforced by our tribe and by our own nature, our brainstem working against us to make us conform. Power. Most of us have power issues. Most of us come out of dysfunctional family systems where power may not have been used wisely or shared equally or even equitably. Because we have issues with power, we end up internalizing beliefs about power and alienating ourselves from our own personal power. Without personal power, we cannot achieve, we cannot overcome, we cannot be better or teach others to be better. We do not succeed without a strong sense of personal power. It can be developed. We're not born with it. In fact, I would argue we are often placed in situations where we will have it taken away from us. What we learn in our first 6 years of existence may have set the stage for a long road of having to relearn self, how to have a strong self, how to rebuild self, how to love self. As adults, we have to stop to evaluate our own operating system, check our beliefs, overcome faulty ones, integrate new beliefs, and own our personal power. Interesting people. One of the most incredible people on the planet today is a man named Wim Hof. He's also known as the Iceman. 30 years ago, he was living in a squat in Amsterdam. Now, textbooks in America have whole chapters on how he learned to use his mind, telemetabolically, to control his body temperature, endocrine response, and immune system. He controls his autonomic nervous system, which was thought to be an automatic process controlled by the subconscious mind and out of the reach of our conscious ability to control. This is not a new idea to me. My father also had a level of telemetabolism. He was the first person to introduce me to two concepts that would guide my life. It was also his side of the family that created a strong connection to the military for me. But the two concepts were martial arts, which he began teaching me at an early age, and to think it off. I remember one day I was trying to open the top of a jar. He walked up behind me and saw that I was struggling. He said, "Think it off." "It isn't stuck. Think it off." I realized that I could. When he would go for yearly physical checkups, he would lower his blood pressure and heart rate by thinking about it. So when I discovered the Iceman, I was impressed, absolutely, but not surprised. His work, like climbing Mount Everest in shoes and shorts, or Mount Kilimanjaro in shorts, in 2 days, completing a marathon in Finland above the Arctic Circle in under -20, so that's -4 degrees Fahrenheit, in shorts, again, finishing over 26 miles in 5 hours and 25 minutes. This can be done if you have a high level of control over your mind. So Wim tells us that all of us have this power that he has, and he teaches others what he knows. Breathing and mental mastery, inner alignment. These are at the core of his teaching. They are also at the core of mine. And partly that comes from a base philosophy for me in martial arts, I think. Breathing, meditation, using mind, understanding energy. Once I was lecturing at a martial arts conference, and the soke of the school that was hosting it was there, and we got talking. I don't remember exactly how we got on the subject of energy work, but he said something about how old masters could throw students without touching them. I said, "Prove it." You know those moments when you're in a large room with lots of people and everyone is talking, until you say something you probably shouldn't have said, and when you did, no one was talking, and everyone heard you, and now everyone is looking at you. It was that. So we kind of had to do it then. So we did. Just like in the Matrix. My hair moved forward before the rest of my body, and then I was pushed backward. He pushed me from several feet away. People like Wim Hof are reminders to us of the incredible inner power that we have. That whatever we think we can do more. Whatever limits we think we have, that's just it. They are only limiting thoughts. We always have more power than we may be allowing ourselves to tap into. He says the cold is his teacher. It is merciless and righteous. It is a source of power. He's found it has nothing to do with the cold, but is a pathway to the lizard brain. Food, fuck, freeze, fight, flight. Most times we're told that our lizard brain is an old primitive enemy to be overcome by our more advanced frontal cortex. Wim is saying that to control our innermost workings, we must engage with the power that the old brain has. The old brain that Wim is leveraging is his subconscious mind. Good lessons here, lots to think about. Mercenaries, the second oldest profession in the world. Alexander the Great employed mercenaries to not only supplement his forces, but to ensure that his troops were trained by the best trained fighters available. Although currently many mercenaries are seen as less than, this was not always the case. Hannibal intentionally took men from all over the known world and molded them into one of the first professional armies of the world. The Romans also made full use of mercenaries. There are even older examples. One of the longest standing legacies, of course, are the Norsemen. The Vikings, as many of us have come to call them, traveled far afield to use their fighting skills. They fought across Syria, Armenia, they were known as the Rus by the Slavs, and controlled territory from Sweden to modern-day Kiev. From the 13th to the 16th century, some of the best-known mercenaries were the Galloglass, an elite class of men who came from the clans of the Hebrides and Highlands of Scotland. They were the deciding element, which prevented Anglo-Norman expansion from England into Ireland. The Irish chieftains always kept the Galloglass close. The 16th century saw a dramatic escalation of violence in Ireland due to the Tudor conquest. At this time, the Galloglass were joined by new Scottish mercenaries, the Redshanks. The flow of mercenaries into Ireland posed such a threat to English occupation that Queen Elizabeth I executed 700 mercenaries to make a point. However, they continued to fight through the 9 Years' War and began to be integrated into many European armies, including fighting for Sweden in the 30 Years' War. During the 1700s, it was estimated that 1/3 of all adult male Scots were serving as mercenaries somewhere in Europe where most wars were utilizing them. The Galloglass were abolished as military units, but their clan names lived on, the 6 oldest and most famous being McCabe, MacDonald, MacDougall, McRory, McSheehy, and McSweeney. Another of the oldest and best-known mercenaries are the Swiss Guard. Switzerland was once a very poor country, and many men sought fortune elsewhere, forming units of fighting men. They became known as one of the most professional and successful and therefore highly sought-after groups. Various units of the Swiss Guards existed for hundreds of years. One of the earliest served the French court for over 400 years. Having a reputation for discipline and loyalty, in 1506, the Swiss Guard became protectors of the Vatican. This papal Swiss Guard is the only original unit that still exists. When the American Revolution broke out in 1775, it started between the 13 colonies of America and the British Empire. The British at the time could not muster an equivalent force to that of the colonies. So a request was sent out for assistance. First it went out to Catherine the Great of Russia, who denied the request. Then the British approached the Dutch government, wanting to hire their Scots Brigade. This again did not materialize. The British turned to the Germans, who at the time had a highly trained and feared mercenary component within their army. The cost was very high to Britain, as the Germans knew they were very good, but Germans did set sail for America in 1776 to fight for England. They were defeated at Trenton and Saratoga Springs, with 5,000 deserting, accounting for the large number of German settlers in New York State. The Americans were not well pleased that they had been forced to fight these mercenaries and pass laws stopping their countrymen from becoming mercenaries and fighting for another government. However, many did, many do, and since then the American government, notably via the CIA, has become the largest recruiter and supplier of mercenaries in the world. The British continued to field non-nationalist units, for example, in 1841, when the Empire felt the need to annex Nepal, and the Gurkha regiments became essential to the British Indian Army. These regiments remained loyal to the British, and there were units that served in both world wars. It has been suggested that these regiments constitute the British Foreign Legion. Several countries have over the years formed non-national mercenary units to supplement their national armies, including the Dutch, and most famously the French, of course, with the French Foreign Legion. Before the U.S. officially entered World War I, there were American pilots flying with the French Air Force, the Escadrille de Lafayette. The squadron was quickly moved to the front, where a German complaint was filed with the American government as to why were its pilots present when the U.S. was neutral. In 1920, the Spanish Foreign Legion was an elite unit of the Spanish Army, comprised by Spaniards, but most of its members were coming from Cuba. The Spanish Foreign Legion's first campaign was in Morocco, then Spanish North Africa. With the success of the War of Rif in 1926, Moroccans would be added to create the Spanish Army of Africa. When Morocco gained independence in 1956, that legion continued as part of the garrison. In 1936, mercenaries from an estimated 53 countries came to fight Franco in the Spanish Civil War. In 1939, after the fall of Poland, many Polish pilots made their way to Britain and enlisted in the RAF. Many became highly decorated. It is said that these men were a major reason why the Germans gave up the persistent bombing of London. When the war ended, there was a huge flyover of every aircraft available for flight over London to celebrate. The Polish pilots were not allowed to take part. Churchill apparently had made some shady deals with Stalin and didn't want to offend him. Politics overshadows the light of the heroes. Again, before U.S. entry into World War II, American pilots had already signed up with the RAF. 3 squadrons were formed, known as Eagle Squadrons, for volunteer U.S. pilots. Charles Sweeney, and where have we heard that name before? A wealthy London businessman working with Canadian flying legend Billy Bishop. And artist Clayton Knight formed the Clayton Knight Committee and processed almost 7,000 applications for Americans who wanted to fight with the RAF and the RCAF, the Royal Canadian Air Force, before the U.S. had officially joined the war. U.S. pilots before Pearl Harbor, an official entry into World War II, went all the way to China and created the Flying Tigers, the first American volunteer group, AVG, of the Chinese Air Force. These pilots were U.S. Army, Navy, and Marine Corps. The shark-faced painted fighters remained among the most recognizable of any World War II aircraft. These 3 squadrons were seen to be mercenaries because of the lucrative nature of their contract, where they made 3 times what they would have in the U.S. forces. When the U.S. was officially involved in 1942, the Tigers became U.S. Army 23rd Fighter Group. During the Arab-Israeli War in 1948, 43 countries had citizens fighting, including a significant number of World War II vets from Britain and the U.S., known as the Mahalniks, those from outside the land. So many Mahal made up the Israeli Air Force that English took over from Hebrew as the service language. After the war ended in 1949, many Mahal returned home, but the village of Kafr Daniel was founded by Mahal veterans from America and the UK. 1961, the Incredibles, the nickname of the Rhodesian Light Infantry, reformed as a commando unit in 1965, became a parachute battalion in 1977, and then disbanded in 1980. It was a collection of Brits, Irish, Americans, South Africans, Mozambique Portuguese, Australians, Kiwis, Canadians, French, West Germans, and an assortment of Scandinavians. At this time, it is noted that there was a particular dislike for the label of mercenary. These men were regular soldiers who fought under the same conditions as their peers. Also called corsairs or privateers, it was believed that mercenaries disappeared over the 19th and 20th centuries, only to suddenly reappear in the 1960s during the decolonization period in Africa and Asia. I think there is sufficient evidence to the contrary, and that there continued to be lots of movement, lots of mercenaries, as there were lots of wars to fight in. Can we safely say then that mercenaries have been consistently used since the beginning of recorded war? In fact, standing armies are the new development, where mercenaries have the longer legacy. In the 1990s, a strange twist seemed to pervade the mercenary world. No longer military units. Now they gathered into and formed companies, private military companies. PMC contractors are civilians authorized to accompany an army into the field. This isn't accurate. These civilians are predominantly former military, often highly trained. A PMC is a legally established enterprise created to make a profit by either providing services involving the potential exercise of armed force in a systemic way and by military means, and/or by the transfer of that potential to clients through training and other practices, such as logistical support, equipment procurement, and intelligence gathering. In the 1990s, there were essentially four main PMCs: Executive Outcomes, which closed in 1998, Sandline International, closed in 2004, Gurkha Security Guards Limited, and DynCorp. Now there are thousands, with the most lucrative being bought up under the umbrellas of huge corporations, including venture capitalist firms. The U.S. actively uses PMCs to carry out a range of activities from typically policing operations such as anti-narcotics to traditionally military tasking such as what was seen in Iraq. The world of security contracting has become highly political, complicated, profitable, influential, and watched closely by the media. The United Nations Working Group on Mercenaries report of 2010 defines the activities most worrisome to those who watch the industry: unnecessary escalation of force, summary executions and general attitudes towards use of deadly force, acts of torture, arbitrary detention, trafficking of persons for sexual exploitation. Also troubling is the frequency of PMCs putting their own employees at risk. What is reality or perception? It becomes difficult to sort out the white hats and the black hats. Armor Group was revealed to be working with Afghan warlords to supply enough armed nationals to fulfill its contract to the U.S., so found by the U.S. Senate Armed Services Committee. DynCorp was involved in sex trafficking. This is indeed a shadowy industry that challenges on many levels: legal, moral, political, economic, environmental, and for contractors themselves, always physically, mentally, emotionally, spiritually, and socially, relationships often taking the brunt. Is it only the PMCs that are out of control? The Washington Post stated in 2010 in their article Top Secret America, A Hidden World Growing Beyond Control, that the U.S. has created a world within itself that is so large, so unwieldy, so secretive. No one knows how much money it costs, how many people it employs, how many programs exist, or exactly how many agencies do the same work. The military complex does not include a government and its military. Now it includes a government, its military, managers of high-tech weaponry conglomerates, speculative financiers, suppliers of natural resources such as oil, and on-the-ground private military companies. The structural dynamic of this complex is no longer defense so much as outright profit. Exiting out of the military is a new phenomenon now, especially if you're a general who would like a board position with a PMC or who would like to have a company of their own. The UN Human Rights Council and General Assembly in 2010 called for a legally binding instrument regulating and monitoring the activities of PMCs at both national and international levels. Laws such as the Geneva Convention have to be ratified and signed by countries willing to participate. These signatures will not preclude a nation's use of non-nationals or its own citizens from hiring themselves out as private contractors. Using the template of foreign legions allows nations to maneuver around Article 47 of the Geneva Convention. Also, the attitude of many nations has always been better to use somebody else's people as cannon fodder, as many non-nationals have traditionally been used as frontline shock troops. This remains in full display when we observe the number of non-nationals continually used by PMCs to fulfill their contracts. There is no mistake that this industry is one of the most controversial in the world. Many people would argue that if a country can come up with the money to hire mercenaries, they can use that money to support their own standing army, to do what needs to be done under a recognized authority, which has clearly outlined codes of conduct and consequences in place. A man was once a Marine. Now he's a mercenary. He has switched uniforms, but is still the same man. His tasking may be very similar. Only the perception of him has really changed. What is really happening here? PMCs can be used as tools for foreign policy as opposed to standing armies, to appease society's new oppositional attitudes towards seeing their sons and daughters killed in war, or to cut costs associated with standing armies, or to have done what is deemed inappropriate by a nation-state. These are still husbands, brothers, fathers, sons, mothers, daughters, wives, sisters, who will be put in harm's way for a nation-state's benefit. there are female security contractors who are involved in a wide range of security operations. As the US and UK together make up 70% of the contracting industry, most pressure has been put on them to act. The UN Working Group has asked for the industry to support the US Congress Stop Outsourcing Security (SOS) Act, to rescind immunity to contractors, to carry out prompt and effective investigation of human rights violations, to ensure that the actual oversight of PMCs is not outsourced to PMCs, to establish a system of federal licensing, to set up vetting procedures for awarding contracts, to ensure that the U.S. criminal justice system applies to companies contracted by the U.S. government. So is there a genealogy of security policy here? There is. In 2008, the Montreux document was developed by the Swiss government and the International Committee of the Red Cross to outline obligations of nation states regarding the use of PMCs, and it recommends 70 good practices. This led to the 2010 International Code of Conduct, which was intended to supplement the Montreux document. The ICOC was again facilitated by the Swiss government, the Geneva Academy of International Humanitarian Law and Human Rights, and the Geneva Center for the Democratic Control of Armed Forces. As of 2011, over 200 private security providers were signatories of the ICOC. There are literally thousands of security companies who fall under the loose definition of what a security contractor is these days. There are no legal implications to these international standards. There are recommendations that have no teeth. What is a mercenary? Is it a gun for hire, like an old-time Western bounty hunter? Is it a non-national who fights in someone else's army? Is it any former military personnel who now works privately, using the same skill sets but for a different employer? What is clear is that PMCs are a current reality and are making inroads to stay for the long term. Historically, they are the long-term security solution, always have been. Standing armies are being reduced either intentionally or indirectly through less enlistment and the cost associated with keeping them when contractors can be hired on a per-contract basis. There have been consistently, in the last 10 years, more contractors to military personnel in the field, at times at a 5-to-1 ratio. It is also clear to me that contractors are receiving the very least in terms of mental and emotional recovery support of any emergency service personnel group. They are in the field the most neglected in terms of support. As troubling as the reality can be within this industry, it does not negate the fact that we are increasingly putting our security in the hands of private personnel, and then through misinformation or negative perception or disinterest in helping to stabilize this growing industry, we're turning away from the increasing need for practices and facilities to attend to the growing health and social issues that come with the deployment of this group of personnel. This is negligence on society's part. Self-regulation does not happen by chance. It happens through expectation, education, and support. There is a mixed message here of, we expect you to control yourselves out there, but when you need help, you're on your own. Society has a love-hate relationship with soldiers at the best of times. Judge them until you need them. Our protectors need protecting. And when they return from doing what society at large asked of them, they need to be given what they need to recover. The second oldest profession in the world is becoming our gatekeepers, the ones who hold lines across our world. Time to try to understand this industry a little better and judge a little less. Self-regulation and security. People who can self-regulate create organizations that self-regulate. In the volatile industry that private security is, having teams of people who can work together at exceptionally high levels of performance is the ideal. But to get that, you need individuals who can level up and down as needed. This is a skill set. Learning self-regulation is part mental mastery, part emotional mastery, part leveraging all that your body can do when it's in a healthy state of being. The results of this level of performance is seen then in relationships, personal and professional. This is the team that walks in and everybody wants to be on. They are so together, moving almost telepathically. There is oneness amongst them. That's training. It's also personal training that involves inner awareness, ability to own your own emotional content, no matter what it is, and work it, dialing up or down, detaching or engaging with it as required. The industry will never be able to regulate itself from the outside, via legislation or oversight, if the people within it cannot self-regulate themselves. My training philosophy. People ask me why I do this work. What's the connection? That's a multi-part story. I'll be breaking that down over the next series of podcasts. I think that war is the most asinine activity that human beings participate in. It costs us incredibly, no matter what angle you look at it from. But I also believe we need to have security platforms that work, and that the people inside those security platforms who are willing to do what society at large demands of them need to be supported. I think we have a responsibility of duty of care that is part of the covenant we have with those who are willing to hold the lines on our behalf. The training programming that has been utilized for decades now to build resiliency, I think, is antiquated and reactive. When I was doing research into sleep deprivation on military personnel, I discovered that the recommendations the U.S. military was setting out in its field manuals on combat stress weren't being trained to. It wasn't aligning training with its own identified solutions. So I created a training program to fill that gap. The basis of all the training I create is that, filling the training gaps that the military keeps leaving. In order for personnel to have what they need when they need it, which is always going to be field-oriented, deployment-oriented primarily, in order to have it then, they have to have been trained in it beforehand. This is a novel idea still when it comes to resiliency, mental health, which I disagree with as a training concept. Resiliency training is as important as knowing how to use your gun, but it doesn't fall into the training schedule the same way. Survival training that is focused on mental or emotional survival is still considered an add-on. Still, given all we know about combat stress and how destructive it can be. This is an ass-backwards way to do things. But it has huge historical momentum. It is organizationally efficient to blame the individual soldier, to call him a coward when he is broken under the weight of battle. This is the way it has been for millennia. The current climate where there is a sense of compassion is a very new development. We are out of the age of the disposable soldier and in the age of the surviving soldier, and we're not equipped. Are soldiers and contractors still deemed to be expendable? Yes, it's maximum liability. Their death is to be expected. Historically, it was lie to them to recruit them, train them, use them up, go get more. Retention and recruiting is not so simple now. We have a veterans crisis because so many are not dying in battle. They are returning home to find a society that doesn't understand them well and doesn't have the level of supports in place that they need. This is in large part because we're doing war better. Soldiers survive at a higher ratio than ever before. Our level of technology to evacuate soldiers to safety and save their lives is unprecedented compared to other times. But then we have the surplus of vets. Mental health, emotional health was never an issue before. Few cared. Across millennia, the aftercare of soldiers was not a priority. Use them up, go get more. No. Train them better, keep them stronger for longer, return them home intact, or as intact as war allows. Great quote. Peter Drucker tells us that management is doing things right. Leadership is doing the right things. I'm going to say that again. Management is doing things right. Leadership is doing the right things. The former Marine turned contractor, who I credit with opening the door to the security world for me to enter into, and was a great support to me when I was starting out, would talk to me about how important it was to do the right thing, even when nobody else was going to know you did it. He really had an understanding of warrior code. I think that code is valuable and largely missing from the world. What a difference it would make if everyone was so focused on doing the right things, even if no one else would ever know. Till next time, peace out.